The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Thomas Chen's penthouse office. He stood there, looking down at the bustling city below, his fingers wrapped around a coffee mug that had long gone cold. The wall behind him displayed framed magazine covers featuring his success story, from a small startup to a tech empire worth hundreds of millions. But something had been eating at him for months now. Every interview, every podcast appearance, every motivational speech he gave, they all ended the same way. You got lucky, they'd say. You had the right connections. It's impossible for regular people to achieve what you did. These words played on repeat in his mind as he watched a homeless man below carefully collecting cans from the trash. Thomas remembered the comment from last week's tech conference that finally pushed him over the edge. Sure, Mr. Chen, you can stand there and tell us anyone can make it, but let's be real. You probably haven't worried about your next meal in decades. He placed the cold coffee on his desk and walked over to the whiteboard where he'd been mapping out his most daring project yet. Not a new app, not a tech innovation, but something far more personal and controversial. His assistant knocked on the door. Your 9 a.m. is here. The board members are waiting in the conference room. Perfect timing, Thomas muttered, straightening his tie. He'd spent all night perfecting this presentation, knowing it would either be seen as brilliant or completely insane. The boardroom fell silent as he walked in. 12 faces turned to him expectantly, notebooks open, tablets ready. These people had been with him through countless product launches and company expansions. But this was different. I'm stepping down as CEO, Thomas announced, his voice steady despite the gravity of his words. The room erupted in confused whispers. He raised his hand, silencing them. Temporarily. For an experiment. He clicked to the first slide of his presentation. We've built this company on the promise that technology can level the playing field. That anyone with dedication can build something extraordinary. But do we really believe that? Photos flashed across the screen. News headlines about growing wealth inequality, comments from social media calling success stories like his fake or privileged, statistics about the shrinking middle class. For years, I've claimed that success isn't about luck, that it's about strategy, persistence, and smart decision-making. Now I'm going to prove it. His CFO leaned forward, frowning. What exactly are you proposing? Thomas clicked to the next slide. I'm going to start over, from zero. No money, no contacts, no resources, just the clothes on my back. And I'm going to build $1 million business from scratch. The room exploded with objections. You can't be serious. The shareholders will panic. This is corporate suicide. But Thomas continued, his voice cutting through the chaos. For 2 years, we've been telling people our business training program can work for anyone, that our financial education tools can transform lives. Do we actually believe that, or are we just selling false hope? He showed them the next slide. A detailed plan for company management during his absence. Lisa will serve as interim CEO. All major decisions will still go through the board. I've prepared press statements explaining my temporary leave of absence for personal reasons. And what if you fail? Asked one of the senior board members, voicing what everyone was thinking. Thomas smiled. Then we learn something valuable about our assumptions and adjust our products accordingly. But if I succeed, he paused, letting the possibility sink in. If I succeed, we prove that our entire mission isn't just marketing talk. We prove that anyone, regardless of their starting point, can build something extraordinary with the right strategy. The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. He could see the wheels turning in their heads, calculating risks and possibilities. I've already chosen the city, he continued. It's far enough away that nobody will recognize me. I'll document everything, every strategy, every failure, every small win. Not for publicity, but for proof. Real, undeniable proof that success isn't about luck. His phone buzzed. A message from his wife. Whatever they say, I'm with you on this. He smiled, remembering their long conversation last night. She'd seen him wrestling with this decision for months, watching him grow increasingly frustrated with the narrative that success was just a lottery ticket. The papers are already drawn up, he said, sliding folders across the table. And leave in 2 weeks, just enough time to ensure a smooth transition. As the board members flipped through the documents, Thomas walked to the window. Below, the same man he'd watched earlier was still collecting cans, methodically working his way down the street. "Everyone in this room started somewhere," Thomas said softly. "We've all had different advantages and disadvantages, but what if we could prove that the basic principles of success work regardless of your starting point?" He turned back to face the board. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm asking for trust. Trust that everything we've built here isn't just about making money, but about proving something fundamental about human potential." The room remained quiet for a long moment. Finally, Lisa, his soon-to-be interim CEO, spoke up. "You're either completely crazy or absolutely brilliant, maybe both, but I think we all know you're going to do this regardless of what we say." Thomas nodded. "I have to. Not just for myself, but for every person who's ever been told their dreams are impossible. It's time to prove that success isn't a matter of luck, it's a matter of strategy. And strategy can be learned, no matter where you start." As the meeting adjourned, Thomas knew there would be more objections, more concerns, more details to iron out. But watching his board members leave the room, already debating the implications of his experiment, he felt more certain than ever. This wasn't just about proving his point, it was about challenging the very narrative of what's possible in today's world. The bus rolled to a stop in downtown Portland at 2 a.m. Thomas stepped out into the cold drizzle, wearing jeans and a worn hoodie he'd bought from a thrift store. His designer clothes and watch were locked away in a storage unit 2,000 miles behind him. All he had now was a basic backpack containing a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and a small notebook. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few late-night workers and people huddled in doorways. The familiar weight of his phone in his pocket was gone. He'd switched it for a basic prepaid model that could only call and text. No apps, no contacts, no safety net. "Hey buddy, you lost." A street cleaner paused his work, genuine concern in his voice. Thomas shook his head, adjusting his backpack. "Just got into town. No any shelters nearby." The man pointed down the street. "Hope Center's about 6 blocks that way. Might be full though, they usually are this time of month when benefits run out." Thomas thanked him and started walking. Each step felt heavy with the reality of what he'd chosen to do. The cold rain soaked through his hoodie, and he pulled it tighter around himself. This wasn't a game or a corporate exercise, this was real life for millions of people. The Hope Center was a converted warehouse with faded brick walls. A small line had already formed outside despite the early hour. Thomas joined the queue, standing behind an older man who clutched a garbage bag full of what looked like his entire life's possessions. "First time?" the man asked, noticing Thomas's nervous glances. "That obvious, huh?" The man nodded. "Name's Pete. Been on and off the streets for 3 years since the factory closed. Word of advice, sleep with your backpack as a pillow. And don't look too clean, it makes people suspicious." Inside, the shelter was a large open space filled with cots. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows. A tired-looking volunteer handed Thomas a thin blanket and pointed him toward an empty cot in the corner. "Breakfast is at 7, she explained. "We've got a computer lab that opens at 9 if you're looking for work. You can stay here for up to 2 weeks while you get on your feet." Thomas lay down on the cot, using his backpack as a pillow just as Pete had suggested. The blanket was scratchy, and the sounds of coughing, snoring, and quiet conversations filled the room. Sleep felt impossible. His mind kept racing, analyzing everything he'd seen since stepping off the bus. Morning came too quickly. The shelter stirred to life as people lined up for breakfast, plain oatmeal, and coffee in styrofoam cups. Thomas sat at a metal table, listening to the conversations around him. A construction worker talking about day labor sites. A woman discussing which restaurants would give away leftover food. Each conversation was a piece of survival knowledge being freely shared. At 9 a.m. sharp, Thomas was first in line at the computer lab. 6 old desktop computers hummed in a small room. While others checked social media or looked up family members, Thomas began his research. City demographics, local businesses, upcoming construction projects, anything that might reveal an opportunity. "You're different," said the computer lab supervisor, watching him take notes. "Most folks come in here looking for quick jobs. You're studying the whole city." Thomas looked up from his notebook. "Just trying to understand where I might fit in." Well, if you're serious about working, talk to Mike at the front desk. He knows all the good day labor spots, better than sitting here all day with theories. Taking the hint, Thomas headed to the front desk. Mike turned out to be a gruff man with calloused hands and sharp eyes. "You look healthy enough," he said, sizing Thomas up. "Got a crew heading to clear out a warehouse in an hour. Pays cash same day. Interested?" That's how Thomas found himself loading heavy boxes onto trucks alongside 5 other men from the shelter. His hands, soft from years of keyboard work, quickly developed blisters. But he kept going, knowing each box moved was another small step forward. During their lunch break, sharing sandwiches provided by the job site, Thomas listened to his co-workers talk. One had been a master electrician before a divorce and drinking problem left him homeless. Another was trying to save enough to get his commercial driver's license renewed. Each person had a story, a reason, a plan, even if those plans sometimes felt out of reach. Back at the shelter that evening, muscles aching, Thomas counted out his day's earnings, $87. It wasn't much compared to what he used to make in an hour, but it was something. More importantly, he'd learned more about the real economy of the streets in one day than he had in years of reading reports. He pulled out his notebook and started writing. Not just numbers and observations, but the names and stories of people he'd met. Pete, who knew every free meal spot in the city. The electrician, whose skills were going to waste. The shelter volunteer who wanted to help but was overwhelmed by need. A pattern was starting to emerge. Not just of problems, but of possibilities. Resources weren't just about money. They were about knowledge, skills, and connections. Even here, especially here, those things had value. As he wrote, a young man at a nearby cot was trying to fill out a job application by the dim light. "Need help with that?" Thomas offered. The man looked up, embarrassed. "The words, they don't always make sense to me." For the next hour, Thomas helped him complete the application, explaining each section clearly. It was a small thing, but the man's grateful smile reminded him of something important. Success wasn't just about personal achievement. It was about lifting others up along the way. That night, lying on his cot, Thomas felt different. The fear and uncertainty were still there, but something else had taken root, a deeper understanding of what he needed to do. This wasn't just about proving success was possible. It was about understanding the real barriers people faced and finding ways to break them down. He fell asleep to the sound of rain on the warehouse roof, his mind already mapping out the next day's possibilities. 2 weeks of manual labor had left Thomas's hands calloused and his mind racing with ideas. Every morning, as he walked to different job sites, he noticed something that others seemed to overlook. Opportunity was literally lying in the streets. It started with a conversation in the shelter's dining area. Pete, the older man who'd first welcomed him, was complaining about the local recycling center. "They changed the rates again," he grumbled, stirring his coffee. "Used to get 50 cents a pound for copper. Now they're offering 35. Thomas looked up from his notebook. "Different centers have different rates?" "Sure do. Some places downtown give you more, but it's too far to haul stuff without a car. Most folks just take what they can get at the closest place." That evening, instead of heading straight back to the shelter after his construction job, Thomas walked to every recycling center within 3 miles. Each one had different prices, different rules, and different hours. He filled pages of his notebook with calculations and observations. The next morning, he approached Pete and 3 other shelter residents who regularly collected recyclables. "What if we worked together?" he suggested. "Pool our resources, split the profits?" Pete looked skeptical. "What's the catch?" "No catch. I found better paying centers, but we need volume to make it worth the trip. Plus, if we work as a team, we can cover more ground." One of the other men, a former warehouse worker named Ray, leaned forward. "Keep talking." Thomas pulled out his notebook, showing them his research. "Look, most people are taking their stuff to Center A because it's closest. But Center B, 20 blocks away, pays 40% more for copper and aluminum. Center C specializes in electronics and pays double for circuit boards. If we coordinate our routes and combine our loads, we could maximize the profits," Ray finished, nodding slowly, "just like warehouse logistics." By noon, they had a plan. Ray knew which construction sites regularly threw out metal materials. Pete had connections with several small auto repair shops that had copper wire and aluminum parts. Another team member, an older woman named Jin who'd been collecting cans for years, knew every bar and restaurant owner in the area. Thomas drew up simple route maps and schedules. They divided the city into sectors, with each person covering specific areas. He negotiated deals with the repair shops. They'd save their recyclable materials for the team in exchange for keeping their lots clean. The shelter manager, Mr. Wilson, watched their planning session with interest. "You're organizing them," he said to Thomas later that day. "Haven't seen anyone do that before." "Just trying to make the work more efficient," Thomas replied. Mr. Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "You know, we've been looking for someone to help with our job skills program. 2 hours a week, teaching basic workplace readiness. Pays minimum wage, but it's steady work." That's how Thomas found himself standing in front of a small group of shelter residents 3 days later, teaching them how to create simple budgets and write basic business plans. He used their recycling team as a case study, showing how organization and strategy could improve any type of work. The recycling operation grew quickly. Within a week, they had 8 people involved. Thomas created a simple system to track everyone's contributions and ensure fair profit sharing. They pooled money to rent a cart, which meant they could transport more materials in fewer trips. "We made 3 times more than I usually do alone," Pete admitted after their first week. "Never thought about doing it this way." The success of their small enterprise didn't go unnoticed. Other shelter residents started asking to join. Local shop owners began saving their recyclables specifically for the team. Even the competing recycling centers took notice. One offered them a bulk rate deal. But it wasn't just about the money. Thomas watched as team members began teaching each other their specialized knowledge. Ray shared his logistics experience. Jin taught others how to build relationships with local businesses. Pete knew which materials were most valuable and how to sort them properly. During one team meeting, held in the shelter's common room over coffee, a new member asked Thomas why he was doing all this. "You could probably find better work with your skills," he said. Thomas looked around at the group, people who'd been strangers 2 weeks ago, now working together like a well-oiled machine. "Sometimes the best opportunities are the ones right in front of us," he replied. "We just have to look at them differently." The shelter's job skills class grew as word spread. Thomas started incorporating real-world examples from their recycling operation, teaching basic accounting, scheduling, and business communication. Mr. Wilson noticed that attendance was higher than it had ever been. "You're not just teaching them job skills," Mr. Wilson observed one evening. "You're showing them how to think like entrepreneurs." Thomas smiled, remembering his own early days in business. Everyone has something to contribute. Sometimes they just need a chance to prove it. By the end of the 3rd week, their team had a steady rhythm. Morning collections, afternoon sorting, and evening planning sessions. They'd established relationships with dozens of local businesses and had a growing reputation for reliability. One night, as Thomas updated their earnings log, he realized something important. This wasn't just about making money anymore. He was watching people rediscover their own value using skills they'd forgotten they had. The former warehouse worker was now coordinating multiple collection routes. The woman who'd been quietly collecting cans for years was training others in customer relations. In his notebook, beneath the day's figures, Thomas wrote, "Success isn't just about seeing opportunities, it's about helping others see them too. Real breakthrough isn't in the business model, it's in the transformation of people who thought their best days were behind them." He looked up at the shelter's dim lights, thinking about how far they'd come in just 3 weeks. This was just the beginning, but already he could see the ripple effects of their small operation spreading through the community. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest opportunities, even if they're found in the things others throw away. 6 months had passed since Thomas first stepped off that bus. The small office he'd rented was nothing fancy, just a converted storage space above a grocery store with mismatched furniture from second-hand shops. But it was theirs. The sign on the door read Green City Solutions, and below it, in smaller letters, Waste Management Consulting. "Still can't believe we have an actual office," Pete said, arranging papers on his desk, his first desk in 3 years. He'd become the team's operations manager, coordinating their growing network of collectors and sorting crews. The recycling operation had evolved into something bigger than anyone expected. Thomas stood by the window, watching their 2 rented trucks being loaded for the morning routes. What started as a small team collecting cans had grown into a full-service waste management consultation business. Got another call from that Italian restaurant on Oak Street, Ray announced, walking in with his tablet, a recent investment for the business. They want to know if we can help them set up a composting system like we did for the Chinese place. The breakthrough had come 2 months ago when Thomas noticed how much food waste the restaurants were throwing away. Regular garbage service was expensive, and the city had started enforcing stricter environmental regulations. Their team didn't just collect recyclables anymore, they helped businesses reduce waste and save money. "Tell them we'll send someone tomorrow," Thomas replied. "And bring the cost analysis we did for the last restaurant. They'll want to see the numbers." The office door opened and Jin walked in with a new face, a restaurant owner they'd been trying to sign for weeks. "Mr. Lee wants to see how we operate," she said, giving Thomas a subtle wink. Jin had gone from collecting cans to becoming their best sales representative. Restaurant owners trusted her because she understood their challenges from ground level. Thomas gave Mr. Lee a tour of their operation. The sorting facility wasn't impressive by corporate standards, just a rented warehouse space with organized sections for different materials. But their process was efficient, and the results spoke for themselves. "We saved the pizzeria down the street $2,000 last month on waste management," Thomas explained, showing Mr. Lee their tracking system. "Our team analyzes your current waste output, identifies what can be recycled or composted, and creates a custom plan to reduce your costs." "And your workers?" Mr. Lee asked, watching the sorting team at work. "They're all people who needed a chance," Thomas finished. "And they're the best at what they do because they understand the value of everything that passes through here." Later that afternoon, Thomas led their weekly team meeting. 30 people now worked for Green City Solutions in various roles. Some handled collections, others worked with businesses on waste reduction plans, and a few managed the growing mountain of paperwork. "We've got a challenge," Thomas announced. "The city's new environmental regulations are hitting small restaurants hard. They need to reduce waste but can't afford expensive systems. Ideas?" The room came alive with suggestions. A former restaurant worker knew which equipment was actually worth investing in. Someone else had connections with a local farm that could use compost. Each person brought their unique perspective to the problem. "What if we created a shared composting system?" suggested one of their newer team members, a woman who'd lived on the streets for 5 years before joining them. "Small restaurants could split the costs. We handle pickup and processing, sell the compost to farms, and everyone saves money." Thomas smiled, writing the idea on their whiteboard. This was why their business worked. Solutions came from people who understood the problems firsthand. The next morning, Thomas visited their newest client, a small family-owned diner. The owner was skeptical at first, but his eyes lit up when Thomas showed him the potential savings. "Your team really knows their stuff," the owner admitted. "Where'd you learn all this?" Thomas thought about his answer carefully. "We learned by paying attention to what others throw away, both materials and opportunities." Back at the office, he found Pete training 2 new team members. They'd hired 5 people from the shelter last month, continuing their practice of giving opportunities to those who needed them most. "Remember," Pete was saying, "every business has different needs. We're not just collecting trash, we're solving problems." Thomas watched the training session, remembering his own first days at the shelter. The lessons he'd learned, they were the foundation of their success. Understanding real needs, finding value where others saw waste, and believing in people's potential. His phone buzzed with a text from Mr. Wilson at the shelter. Another group was interested in their job training program. They'd expanded it to include practical business skills, and word was spreading. "Got the monthly numbers," Ray called out, waving a report. Their revenue had doubled again. The composting program was taking off, and they were adding new business clients every week. Thomas sat at his desk, a simple folding table that he kept to remind himself of where they started. He opened his notebook, now filled with 6 months of plans, ideas, and lessons learned. "We need to talk about expansion," Jin said, sitting down across from him. 3 restaurants in the next town overwant our services. We're going to need another truck." Looking around the busy office, Thomas saw not just a growing business, but a community. Every person there had a story of struggle and resilience. They'd built something together that was more than just profitable, it was changing lives. One step at a time, he replied, but he was already thinking about the possibilities. Their model worked because it served everyone. Businesses saved money, the environment benefited, and people got chances they deserved. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the office windows. Another day of small victories and steady progress. Thomas watched his team at work, each person focused and purposeful. This was what real success looked like, not just numbers on a page, but lives being transformed, one opportunity at a time. The local news crew arrived at Green City Solutions just before sunrise. They wanted to catch the morning collection routes, to see firsthand how a group of formerly homeless individuals had built one of the city's fastest-growing waste management companies. Just act natural, Thomas told his team as they prepared for their daily operations. Do what you always do. The reporter, a young woman with genuine curiosity in her eyes, watched as Pete organized the morning routes. So you were one of the first employees? She asked him. Pete smiled, his weathered face showing pride. I remember when this was just a few of us collecting cans. Now look at us. He gestured to the warehouse where 20 people were efficiently sorting materials, each knowing their role perfectly. The camera followed Ray as he trained new team members on their composting system. The key is understanding that nothing is really waste, he explained, showing them how to test soil samples. Everything has value if you know how to use it. Thomas watched from his office, remembering their journey. The business had grown beyond just helping restaurants reduce waste. They now operated a full training program, teaching everything from basic job skills to financial literacy. Every person who came through their doors had a story, and every story was about transformation. Your company seems to hire primarily from homeless shelters, the reporter noted during her interview with Thomas. Isn't that risky for a business? Thomas leaned forward in his chair. Actually, it's our greatest strength. Who better to understand the value of resources than people who've had to make the most of everything? Our team brings perspectives that traditional businesses often miss. The story aired the following week, and the response was immediate. Their phone started ringing nonstop. Other businesses wanted to learn about their waste reduction programs. Shelters from neighboring cities called about implementing similar training programs. We need to expand our training space, Jin announced during their morning meeting. The small classroom they'd set up was now constantly full. People are coming from 3 towns over to learn our system. Thomas looked around the room at his core team. What do you think? Are we ready to grow bigger? We have to, Pete said firmly. There are too many people out there who just need a chance, like we got. They decided to turn their afternoon staff meeting into a planning session. Everyone contributed ideas about how to handle the growth while staying true to their mission. Remember that empty warehouse on Pine Street? Ray suggested. The owner's been trying to rent it for months. We could turn it into a training center. The idea caught fire. Team members started sketching layouts on the whiteboard, classrooms, workshop spaces, even a small cafeteria. Someone suggested partnering with local restaurants to provide food service training alongside their waste management programs. We could teach people multiple skills at once, Jin added excitedly. Waste management, customer service, basic business operations, everything we've learned. That evening, Thomas met with Mr. Wilson from the shelter where it all began. The shelter's job program had been transformed by their partnership, with over 30 former residents now employed full-time. You've created something special here, Mr. Wilson said, watching people leave after their training session. It's not just about jobs anymore. You're building a community. He was right. Thomas had noticed how their employees looked out for each other. When someone struggled, others stepped in to help. When someone succeeded, everyone celebrated. They'd created a support system that went far beyond the workplace. A week later, they signed a lease on the Pine Street warehouse. The renovation would take time, but everyone pitched in after their regular shifts. People brought skills from their past lives: construction, electrical work, plumbing. Each contribution made the space more their own. Local businesses started reaching out about partnerships. A construction company offered to donate materials. A tech firm wanted to provide computers for a digital skills lab. The network kept growing, each connection creating new opportunities. "Look at this," Ray said one morning, showing Thomas an email. A business school professor wanted to study their model of social enterprise. "They want to understand how we're making this work." The answer was simple, though not what academics might expect. Their success came from understanding that everyone had value to contribute. The woman who'd been collecting cans for years knew every back alley and business owner in the city. The former accountant who'd lost everything in a medical bankruptcy now managed their books. Each person's experience, even their struggles, added something unique to the mix. One Friday afternoon, Thomas overheard two new trainees talking during their break. "I used to think I was done, one said. "Like my life was over when I lost my home. But seeing everyone here, how they built this place, it makes you think differently." "Yeah," the other replied. "Yesterday I helped figure out a better sorting system for the electronics recycling. First time in years someone actually asked for my opinion about anything." These conversations happened daily now. People who'd been invisible to society were rediscovering their worth. The business wasn't just growing, it was changing how people saw themselves. The local paper ran a feature calling them the company that turns lives around. But Thomas knew it wasn't that simple. They weren't turning lives around, they were just creating space for people to rebuild themselves. As the sun set on another busy day, Thomas stood in the doorway of their expanding facility. Trucks were returning from their routes, training sessions were wrapping up, and tomorrow's schedules were being prepared. A small group of trainees walked past, laughing about something. 6 months ago, some of them had been sleeping in shelters. Now they were learning business skills, earning steady paychecks, and making plans for their futures. This was the real network effect, not just business connections or market growth, but the exponential impact of people believing in themselves and each other. Every success story became inspiration for someone else. Every lesson learned became knowledge to share. "Ready for tomorrow?" Pete asked, locking up for the night. Thomas nodded, thinking about all the new opportunities ahead. "Always ready, there's still so much more we can do." 14 months into his journey, Thomas stood in front of a digital map displaying their operations across 3 cities. Green dots showed their collection routes, blue marked their training centers, and red highlighted partner businesses. The screen took up an entire wall of their new headquarters, a renovated warehouse that housed both their operations and training facilities. "The Seattle expansion is going better than expected," Pete reported during their morning briefing. He'd grown into his role as regional director, overseeing operations in all 3 cities. The team there just signed contracts with 2 major restaurant chains. Thomas nodded, remembering how nervous they'd been about expanding to other cities. But their model had proven itself again and again. Each new location started the same way, partnering with local shelters, identifying people with potential, and building from the ground up. "What about the new app?" Thomas asked, turning to Ray, who'd discovered a hidden talent for technology. Their waste management tracking system had started as a simple spreadsheet but evolved into something more sophisticated. Ray pulled up the beta version on the main screen. "We're testing it with 20 restaurants this week. It lets them track their waste reduction in real time, schedule pickups, and see their environmental impact. The drivers love it too, makes route planning much more efficient." The app had been Ray's idea. "If we're going to grow," he'd said, "we need better tools." He taught himself coding through online courses, working late into the night to build something that matched their specific needs. Jin walked in, holding her tablet. "You need to see this," she said, pulling up a video. It was a news segment about their Seattle operation, featuring interviews with restaurant owners and team members. The reporter called them a revolution in social enterprise. "That's nice," Thomas said, "but how are the numbers looking?" "Better than projected," Jin replied with a smile. The Seattle location broke even in just 2 months. Portland and Tacoma are showing 30% growth this quarter. But here's the really interesting part. Other cities are calling. They want to know if we can expand there too. Thomas walked to the window overlooking their main sorting facility. The floor below was a hive of activity. Teams efficiently sorted materials, loaded trucks, and processed data. What had started as a small recycling operation now employed over 200 people across 3 cities. "Remember our first week?" Pete asked, joining him at the window. just a handful of us with a borrowed cart, trying to figure out the best routes for collecting cans. Hard to believe it was just 14 months ago, Thomas replied. But the core principles hadn't changed. Find value where others see waste, give people opportunities to prove themselves, and build systems that benefit everyone. The afternoon brought a visit from their technology partners. The app was part of a larger platform they were developing, one that would help other cities replicate their model. Thomas watched as Ray presented the system to the developers. Each business has different needs, Ray explained, showing how the app adapted to various users. A coffee shop's waste stream is different from a hardware store's. Our system learns these patterns and optimizes accordingly. The developers were impressed. One of them spoke up, "This is more advanced than most enterprise software we've seen. And you built this in-house?" "We built it because we needed it," Ray said simply. When you understand the problem from ground level, the solutions become clearer. Later that day, Thomas led a training session for new team members. The classroom was full of people from different backgrounds, former professionals who'd hit hard times, young people who'd never had opportunities, older workers who'd been displaced by technology. Success isn't about luck, he told them, sharing stories from their company's growth. It's about seeing opportunities others miss and being willing to work together to make things happen. A hand raised in the back. "But how did you know it would work? Starting a business from nothing seems impossible." Thomas thought about his answer carefully. "We didn't know it would work. We just knew that the current system wasn't working for a lot of people. Sometimes that's enough reason to try something new." The day ended with a strategy meeting about their next expansion. Maps and data filled the screens, showing potential cities, demographic information, and market analyses. But Thomas kept steering the conversation back to the human element. "Numbers are important," he reminded his team, "but our real strength is in our people. Each new city means new opportunities to change lives." As they discussed locations, a message came in from their Tacoma operation. They just graduated their first class of trainees, 30 people who'd started in their program 3 months ago. The photo showed proud faces holding certificates, ready to start their new jobs. "That's what it's all about," Pete said, looking at the image. "Everything else, the technology, the expansion, the profit margins, it all comes back to giving people a chance to rebuild their lives." Thomas stayed late that evening, reviewing plans for their next training center. The building designs included classrooms, workshops, and something new: a small business incubator where graduates could develop their own entrepreneurial ideas. Still working. It was the night custodian, an older man who'd been with them since the early days. "Just thinking about what's next," Thomas replied. "We've built something good here, but there's so much more we could do." The custodian nodded, leaning on his broom. "You know what I tell people about this place? I tell them it's not just about recycling trash, it's about recycling hope, giving it back to people who thought they'd lost it for good." Thomas wrote those words in his notebook. 14 months ago, he'd set out to prove that success wasn't about luck. Now, with 3 cities under operation and more on the horizon, he'd proven something even more important: that when people are given the right opportunities and support, they can rebuild not just businesses, but entire communities. The lights of the city twinkled outside his window. Somewhere out there, tomorrow's team members were sleeping in shelters, just as he had 14 months ago. But soon, they'd have their chance to be part of something bigger than themselves. That's what empire building really meant, not just growing a business, but growing hope, one opportunity at a time. 18 months into his experiment, Thomas sat in his simple office, preparing for the moment he both anticipated and dreaded. The company was now valued at $12 million, with operations in 3 cities and over 200 employees. But today wasn't about the numbers, it was about the truth. "Are you sure about this?" Pete asked, standing by the door. He was one of the few who'd learned Thomas's real identity last week. "Things are working so well. Why risk changing that?" Thomas looked at the newspaper on his desk. The headline read, "From Homeless to Business Leaders, the Green City Solutions Story." Below it was a photo of their team, proud faces showing how far they'd come. "They deserve to know," Thomas replied. "Everyone who's been part of this journey deserves to know what they've really accomplished." He'd called an all-hands meeting for that afternoon. The main warehouse floor had been cleared, Chairs set out for hundreds of employees, some traveling from Seattle and Tacoma to be there. The energy in the room was electric. People knew something big was coming, but nobody expected what they were about to hear. Thomas walked to the front, looking at the faces before him. Ray, who'd taught himself coding to build their technology platform. Jin, whose sales skills had helped them expand across cities, and dozens of others who'd transformed their lives through sheer determination. 18 months ago, he began, his voice steady. I stepped off a bus with nothing but a backpack and a theory. A theory that success isn't about luck or privilege, it's about strategy, determination, and working together. The room was silent, everyone leaning forward slightly. What most of you don't know is that before I came here, I was the CEO of Chen Technologies. He paused as murmurs spread through the crowd. I left everything behind, my company, my wealth, my identity, to prove that success is possible from any starting point. The silence broke. People started talking all at once. Thomas raised his hand, waiting for quiet. I know this might feel like a betrayal, he continued, like I wasn't who you thought I was. But everything we built together, every innovation, every victory, every transformation, that was all real. More real than anything I'd accomplished before. He clicked a button, and photos appeared on the screen behind him, their first recycling routes, the opening of their training center, graduations, expansions. This company wasn't built by my past success. It was built by people who society had written off, people who proved that with the right opportunity and support, extraordinary things are possible. Pete stepped forward. When he told me the truth last week, I was angry at first. Felt like we'd been part of some experiment. But then I realized something. Everything we achieved on our own merits. His background doesn't change that. Ray stood up next. He could have funded this venture with millions. Could have hired experienced managers and consultants. Instead, he started from zero, just like us. And look what we built together. Thomas unveiled the next phase of their company's evolution. Starting today, Green City Solutions becomes partially employee-owned. Every person who's been part of this journey will receive shares in the company they helped build. The announcement was met with stunned silence, followed by thunderous applause. But Thomas wasn't finished. We're also launching the Fresh Start Foundation, funded with $5 million from my personal assets. The foundation will help people experiencing homelessness start their own businesses using the model we've proven here. He showed them the numbers, how their waste management system had revolutionized the industry, how their training programs had achieved an 85% success rate, how their technology platform was being requested by cities across the country. But the real success isn't in these numbers, he said, closing his presentation. It's in the lives changed, the communities strengthened, the proof that when people are given a chance and the right support, anything is possible. The questions came fast after that. Some were angry, feeling deceived. Others were curious about his previous life. But most wanted to know about the future, how they could help expand the model, how they could teach others what they'd learned. One of their newer team members raised her hand. Does this mean it was all just an experiment? That none of it was real? Thomas shook his head. This was the most real thing I've ever done. My previous success came with advantages, connections, education, resources. But this came from raw human potential, from people who refused to be defined by their circumstances. He told them about his first night in the shelter, about learning to see value where others saw waste, about watching people rediscover their own worth. The experiment wasn't to prove that I could succeed again. It was to prove that success is possible for anyone willing to think strategically and work together. The meeting ended, but people stayed, forming small groups, discussing what they'd heard. Thomas watched as his team, now his partners, began planning for the future. They weren't just talking about business expansion anymore, but about how to help others replicate their success. Later that evening, as the sun set over the city, Thomas stood on the roof of their building with Pete and Ray. You know, Pete said, when you first showed up at the shelter, I thought you were either crazy or naive. Turns out you were a little of both. Thomas laughed. The best ideas usually require a bit of both. Ray looked out at the city lights. So what happens now? Will you go back to your old life? This is my life now, Thomas replied. We've built something here that's bigger than any one person. The only difference is now we can help even more people write their own success stories. As they stood there, watching the city below, Thomas thought about his journey. He'd set out to prove that success wasn't about luck. What he'd proven instead was something far more powerful, that when people are given the tools, trust, and opportunity to succeed, they can build something extraordinary. The experiment was over, but the real work was just beginning. Across the country, people were waiting for their chance to rewrite their own stories, and now they had a blueprint to show them how.